Thank you very much. And I also will add that I'm going to jump around a little bit when it comes to hospitality and rebuilding hospitality beyond hotel investment. And the reason why is twofold. For one, my colleague Lorraine Marjorie in Atlanta is the former manager of hotel investment in Israel, and he had planned to make this pitch about investment in hotels in Israel. I luckily did work with him for about 5 years on many of those initiatives and led many investors to Israel. But I believe that tourism needs kind of a reset before I jump in to building capacity. And I also don't think that 15 minutes will do justice to the real esoteric language that Lorene would have used, or even that I'll jump into when it comes to planning that. I think we can plan a webinar about that at another date. But now going on what I wanted to talk about, in speaking with the organizers, I was told, first of all, this is the World Zionist Village, and this is JNF. We want to talk about Zionism and your topic, which for me is tourism, and tie all those things together. And I felt it was really important for me to tie my origin story or personal narrative that goes so much into all of these things before I jump into it, because I think it's very, very relevant to how we should be thinking about tourism. So first things first, my first trip to Israel. As you can hear, I'm American. Not every day that you hear from an American that actually works as a leader of a mission in the U.S. for the state of Israel. I'm not an Israeli citizen, but I do lead on matters of tourism in the northeast of the U.S., largest outbound market in the world. So how did I get here? Went on my first trip in 1999. It was a 5-week trip for teens, and it's where I fell in love with Israel. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. I was frequently the only Jewish kid in the room, and I wanted to feel at home. And I fell in love with the Negev Desert on that 5-week trip. I loved Israelis, their big, broad smiles, and I am one of few in my generation, I think, that still remembers Israelis during the peace process, when there was this pervasive hope for peace among so many Israelis. And I hope someday we get back there, but I cherish that memory in times like this. I then graduated and went to Ohio State. Actually, a previous speaker, Sam and I both went to Ohio State at the same time, and he's going to get some shout outs here. And my third week of college was 9/11. We had already had the Intifada raging on campus. Caravan for Democracy, I think, was born around that time and had a big impact on my advocacy. I became a leader on campus. I was president of the AEPI chapter. I was head of our pro-Israel group. And I then studied abroad at Ben Gurion University of the Negev, driving home that love of the Negev. And even though we have deserts in the U.S., I'm from Ohio. We didn't go to deserts before I went on those first trips. So I really fell in love with the Negev desert when I was there, and it was a very different Israel for me at that time. It was also the Intifada, albeit the end of the Intifada, which we didn't know. And that plays into this tourism recovery, which I'll get into. Fast forward again, I found myself in New York. Classic story, someone trying to become a musician and also working in the city. And I changed jobs 6 times in my first year in New York. I moved there in fall of 2005. And my third job was actually at an Israeli tour operator. I did not come into tourism knowing that I wanted to be a tourism professional, but I knew I wanted Israel in my life. And I worked there from March of 2006 all the way through most of July of 2006. If you know those dates, it ended with the second Hezbollah war and conflict that we had. And I lost my job. And I then got a job in Israeli tourism. I did my interview in Hebrew with the boyfriend of the owner. They thought that was cool. And I did incoming tourism to New York when I realized I was an Israel person doing tourism, not a tourism person that sort of sold Israel before, because it wasn't for me. A year later, I went back to that original job, and I never left Israeli tourism. But what has solidified that decision happened in that year, because in 2007, in the spring, when I met Sam, actually, in earnest, I took the first ever ASB spring break. And we rebuilt the North, and for me, it was just so emotional that this war that took the job that I loved the most of those 6, I was rebuilding the North. And it truly gave me that inspiration to go back into Israeli tourism and stay there. And now I'll finally land on how I ended up choosing Israeli tourism and why I think we need to change the way we think about it. And that was in around 2008. tourism was actually very, very good at that time. And we'll talk about those projections. I was sitting at my desk, and I had now worked in Israeli tourism again for a little over a year, bringing Christian groups, bringing Jewish groups. They kind of were like, "You're from Ohio, you know Christians. Why don't you build our business?" And I did, and I had this feeling before then, as I think so many of us really ardent Zionists do, that my connection to Israel was so personal that there's almost you wouldn't understand with other people until I finally saw these groups coming back. There's a sense of, yes, I want to advocate for Israel, but I don't expect people to really get what I get, because it's such a personal relationship you make when you go to Israel. And what I realize is each person is making it, and they're making it in their own way. And that is when I took a step back and I thought to myself, because I had thought maybe I'll work for the JNF, maybe I'll work for an APAC or something like that with my career. And I thought, who is trying to just make sure we get as many tourists as possible? Because I see all these organizations bringing tourism as a means to an end, and a very good end that they're going after, but they're not necessarily getting in front of it and saying, we need to just get more tourists. So for the rest of my career, I'd go to these conferences and I'd hear politicians talk about their trip to Israel. That's what they were doing. They were just, yes, somebody else paid for it, but they were talking about an amazing experience in Israel. And I made it my mission to get as many people to Israel as possible, because I believe very strongly that if we do that, we can change the tides of public opinion. First-person narratives are the very strongest tool we have in combating anybody that is anti-Israel, because the truth is on our side. And people hear the experience in your voice. They can hear a smile over the radio, actually. When a DJ smiles, they also hear experience when you're talking seriously about it. So that's how I got into it. And I think that we, as organizations, the JNF is one of those organizations that actually bucks the trend. I do think they do tourism to get as many people to Israel as they can. It's one of the few that do that. But very few do, and they don't just say, from a congregational rabbi's perspective, okay, your trip's not going this year. How are you going to get other congregants to go and take whatever trip suits them? Because that's how we get those narratives. Now diving into, fast forwarding, by the way, that same moment, I'm like, man, maybe I'll work for the Ministry of Tourism someday. And I remember being like, nah, that's not going to happen. I'm not Israeli, so on and so forth. But I continued down the path anyway. And that's how, after working at 2 Israeli tour operators and representing a hotel, I was asked to represent the ministry. So moving into the hotel investment realm, we've long had a shortage of hotels. And it's so great that we're investing in World Zionist Village in those hotels. I think that what you need to take with you is this needs to be a personal commitment if you are going to invest in hotels in Israel, for a couple of reasons. One, we don't have a strong publicly traded market. We don't have investors coming that are able to see all of the information you might at a Smith report. But we do have a flourishing industry whenever we're given the chance. 2019, we had a record tourism level. In 2023, we actually eclipsed those numbers September to September, over 1 million tourists from North America. So it's a very worthwhile investment, but it's not one that we have from the public realm. It's one that we will get from those that are personally committed to it, and there is nothing more worthy of an investment than that. How am I on time? That's it? Okay. So what I would end with is, if you're looking at hope for how this is going to recover, right now we have a unique situation where tourism is literally as good as it possibly could be to Israel. We have every single flight full. It's just that we don't have enough flights. And whenever we get those flights back, we will see a recovery, hopefully along the lines of 2014. In 2014, we had an 11-month recovery. It's miraculous that Israel bounces back the way that it is. If you want to know how you can help, talk about tourism and keep talking about your visits to Israel, which so many have taken on those JNF trips, because it's the word of mouth and spreading it that's going to get people to come and have that first-person narrative. Thank you so much.